Right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar, GDPR. Are you ready? Just to clarify, first and foremost, you can see we've got a couple of logos on screen there, HPP Systems and Cameron. Just to confirm, we are sister companies. So if you've signed up via either HPP or Cameron, you are absolutely in the right place. And the information, obviously, you're going to get today covers both companies, basically. So my name's Phil Denham. I'm the Commercial Director here at HPP. And my role, as my title suggests, is primarily looking after the sales and marketing side of the business. So if you think on a day-to-day basis, I'm not a techie, I'm not someone putting in IT systems and supporting IT systems. So I do come at this very much from a user point of view. And hopefully what that means is that we're going to try and take a very common sense approach to GDPR, what it means, how we get ourselves ready, and how we prepare ourselves for it. We are, of course, at HPP and Cameron, an IT company primarily. So we do IT and software, which means that our expertise really lies on the cybersecurity side of GDPR. We are going to touch on the kind of the business process side of it as well, but the main focus of today is going to be the IT security side, and there's a good reason for that we'll go on to, basically. Just in terms of a little bit of housekeeping, if you have questions along the way, in your GoToWebinar toolbar that you should have, there is a section for questions. If you can type anything that you've got in there as you go along, I will pick it all up at the end. You can ask questions at the end or as you go along. Just the way that my screens are set up, it's very tricky for me to spot questions as they come in. But what I will do is obviously pick them all up at the end and answer as many of them as I possibly can do within the time given. The webinar normally takes around about 45, 50 minutes-ish, which gives us some time at the end for questions. But if you want further discussions afterwards, I'll give my contact details, absolutely fine. And one final sort of advance apology. I am doing this webinar at the moment one-handed, left-handed. I'm normally right-handed, but unfortunately I've gone and broken my upper arm, my humerus, which basically makes my whole right arm out of action at the moment. So if my clicks are a little bit off and I end up skipping on slides a little bit, I apologize, but I'm getting a little bit better each day by day at this. Okay, so let's get started. So first and foremost, I do have to give a bit of a disclaimer here. As I mentioned, we're an IT company as opposed to a legal company. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is my opinion, my interpretation of the GDPR legislation. Now, there are 99 articles in the legislation. If you want to know this inside out, details, facts, everything, officially the only way you're ever really going to do that is to sit down and read that legislation from start to finish. It's the only piece of legislation I've ever read from start to finish, so I can't compare it to any others, but it's pretty tough. It's not the easiest read in the world. There are certainly areas in it that I find very ambiguous and open to interpretation. But again, like I say, I think we can take a very common sense approach to a lot of this stuff. There are also things as well in there that I still find myself asking questions about and have asked other people for their opinions, and I will share some of those grey areas with you and which direction kind of I think we should go with them and what the best kind of approach is to both take from a business point of view, and also to make sure we're covered and we understand the decisions that we're making along the way. Okay, we're going to start right at the beginning, though, certainly for anyone that isn't familiar with GDPR and hasn't come across it and is starting right at the beginning. So first and foremost, it stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It was also known as the EU Data Protection Regulation during its time in terms of it all coming together. And basically, it's a legislation that will come into practice across the whole of the EU in May 2018. Just to clarify that as well, in terms of what happens with the UK and the EU, if stroke when or whatever's going on with all that sort of things, if we leave the EU, or maybe should I say when we leave the EU, this will carry on into UK law, and the process has already started to make sure that happens. There has been talk of a few minor tweaks around that when it changes over, but they are incredibly minor, and they're very, very unlikely to change what we're going to talk about today. GDPR, the new legislation, takes over from laws that were put in place back in 1998. So this is well overdue. And also it was launched officially 2 years ago, or nearly 2 years ago, back in May 2016. And what that did was give us a 2-year transition period. So effectively it was announced, this is what's going to happen. You've got 2 years to get ready before it comes into force. So ultimately that date, 25th of May 2018, is when it comes into force, which means we need to be as ready as we possibly can be for that date, not start thinking about it then. Okay, this slide is my end of the world slide, and if you're a LinkedIn user or you've done any searching on Google and tried to find things, I'm sure you will have found a lot of scaremongering out there. There are a lot of people that I believe are coming at this from the wrong angle, in a real scaremongery kind of way, thinking that we're going to get fined left, right, and centre, that every business is going to get kind of slapped with £20 million fines here, there, and everywhere. Now, when this comes into force, there's an organisation called the ICO who will regulate and basically be in charge of investigating and dishing out any fines if appropriate. And they've been quite open in saying that the whole idea of this is not to go down and close down businesses left, right, and centre. It's actually much more of a deterrent, first and foremost, for larger businesses, but also to make sure we take it seriously. And it's important that we take it seriously. And what we'll talk about a bit around today is about the spirit of GDPR and what that means about protecting individuals' data, rather than just being this sort of hardline piece of legislation that we all have to follow. Let's understand what the purpose of it is and how we can follow it from there. So in my opinion, it's nowhere near as scary as a lot of people are making out, and there's a lot of ways that we can control and conform with this legislation. So the basics of it are that, first and foremost, it's designed to protect individuals' data. So if you think about this from a consumer point of view and the amount of information we give out, for example, I'm currently in the process of renewing my home insurance. I did my car insurance not that long ago. The amount of information that I'm handing over about myself to businesses, and of course, there's probably hundreds of businesses that hold this sort of information about me. I have an expectation that they're going to look after that, and it's not going to fall into the wrong hands because they're not going to suffer some sort of data breach. And also they're going to use it in the way that it was expected to be used. So it isn't going to get passed around to third parties or other areas of their business that I didn't authorize that to happen with. That's a pretty, I think, legitimate expectation to have. So therefore it covers the processing and the management of that data, so how it's used and what they do with it. And it also covers the protection of that data, so making sure that it is looked after and not lost and gets into the wrong hands. And it's also important to point out this is similar to the current regulation. So ultimately what you're all adhering to right now, the laws that are in place here today and have been in place since 1998, they're not too far away from it, and they have been updated and modernized around kind of the different challenges around technology and obviously around data protection, but very similar to the DPA, which is the Data Protection Act 1998. The headline that you really will have seen will be about the changes to the fines. So under the current rules, if we take TalkTalk as an example, so TalkTalk, big case in the UK, where they lost a huge amount of customer data through a data breach, through a hack which originated through their website. They were initially fined £100,000 and basically given a bit of a clean up your act advice. When they didn't do that, they got a further £400,000 fine. And at the time, and as things stand now, that's the maximum fine that can be given out, £500,000. Under the GDPR, this will go up to €20 million or 4% of global turnover, whichever is higher. So obviously for most small and medium-sized businesses, that will be 20 million euros. And obviously for larger businesses, it could be much more significant. That equates roughly around exchange rate to about £17 million. So obviously that change from 500,000 to 17 million is designed to act as a deterrent. Nothing more than that, really. It is absolutely designed to act as a deterrent and to give the power to punish people that really do not pay attention to that and do not look after customer data. And that's what you will have seen probably as the headline, these big fines that are going to come in place. So in a nutshell, all companies, no matter what their size, are responsible for protecting the data they hold and using it lawfully and the way that it was intended. And if they don't do that, then there's obviously significant fines that can be dished out. But like I say, we've got to remember this is similar to what we have now in place. All right, the fines are changing, but the rules are pretty similar in terms of how we look after things. And so the title of today's webinar is Are You Ready? And I read a lot of news stories. I read some yesterday actually about how ready people are. There was one that said that 25, this was a survey done in London, 25% of businesses in London still hadn't even heard of GDPR. And another that said that when of some businesses surveyed around the UK, about a third said that they thought they were ready. Now, in my opinion, I think businesses are a bit more ready than they might think they are, partly because they possibly don't understand GDPR and how similar it can be. So I think it's somewhere between 50 and 90. And the ones that are more towards the 50% are often the ones that are in some sort of cycle with their IT, i.e. they replace all of their servers, they update their security, all of their workstations on, say, a 5-year rotation process. And those that are sort of at a 4-year stage of that and about to do that are probably further away than those who have modernized their IT within the last sort of couple of years, and as part of that put in a cybersecurity process. When it comes to looking after the data and your customer data, I genuinely believe that most businesses are doing that pretty well already. If you think about the data that you hold on your customers, on your suppliers and your staff, if you weren't already taking care of that and using it in the way that it was intended, then that's pretty bad business practice. That probably would have affected your reputation and kind of your ability to be a successful business in the first place. So the chances are you're doing this pretty naturally because it's a sensible thing to do. And likewise, in terms of protecting your data, in terms of making sure you're not hacked, a lot of businesses have done things about that in the last couple of years because it makes good business sense to do that. And a big part of GDPR, certainly when we look at the big cases, what they sometimes refer to as the super cases, where these big businesses get hacked, so the TalkTalks of the world, the Sonys of the world, Domino's, and of course the NHS, well, these have generally been about data breaches, so data being lost out of that business through someone getting into that network and taking it effectively. So you can see here 57%. This is from 2016, this survey. We haven't had data yet out for 2017 because it takes a little while to come through. But from 2016, 50% of those reported breaches were from hacking or malware. And just to confirm, we use the word malware a few times. It basically stands for malicious software. So sort of an umbrella term for any kind of virus, anything like that that's designed to cause harm or take data. And the most common one we see nowadays is something called ransomware. Again, think NHS, this was a ransomware attack, effectively where someone hacks into the network, they encrypt the data on the servers or on the workstations. So basically put a very, very strong password on it, and then they charge a ransom to get access to that data again. And quite often that process involves stealing that data at the same time. So under that umbrella term of malware, 57% of those data breaches were caused there, 22% from unintended disclosure. So this is probably something we've all done accidentally at some point, picked the wrong name off your little drop down on your email and sent something to someone that you shouldn't have done. I get emails for example, for different fills that wasn't intended to me. Still happens from time to time. Then we've got loss of portable devices, so mobile phones, tablets, laptops. Of course, at the minimum, most mobile phones now have company email on there, if not access to CRM systems or financial systems. Physical loss, so paperwork, notebooks, anything like that. And then a little bit of other that's unclassified there as well. And I think the important thing here is that we can actually limit a huge amount of this. If we just take the hacking side of things, of course, we have software and we have solutions in place that can massively limit the risk of hacking and the impact that malware can have on your network. When it comes to unintended disclosure, if this is a massive problem, you're sending sensitive information, we can both restrict the type of information that can be sent out of a business, or even use something like encryption so that only the intended end user has the permission to open that document, for example. Although you might not be able to stop people being forgetful and losing devices or getting them stolen, what we can do is we can put control around them in terms of being able to wipe those devices so that the information becomes absolutely kind of useless and inaccessible on there. And even in terms of physical loss, we can control things like what can be printed out from a network. So limiting the amount of stuff that actually becomes physical documents that could be lost in the first place. So there's lots of things we can do that make sure we can reduce these causes, these main causes of data breaches within our organization. So they're certainly not out of our control. Probably the biggest question I'm getting asked now, certainly as we get closer and closer to the GDPR date, is what if? So if a breach does happen, and I don't believe there's any kind of 100% ways of stopping things happening, but if something does happen, then what do you need to do? So first and foremost, you'll need to self-report. So I mentioned earlier the ICO, the governing body in the UK, you would have to self-report yourself to the ICO and explain that you've had a data breach. Now, there is a caveat that in the GDPR states that you only have to do that if it's deemed worthy of reporting, which means that it's likely to result in the risk to rights and freedoms of individuals, which is described as being something that could result in discrimination, damage to their reputation, financial loss, loss of confidentiality, or any other social or economic disadvantage. Now, I've gone through everything in my mind to think about what could be lost that doesn't fall into that, and I can't think of anything. If somebody lost my name and my email address, kind of by definition, there's some loss of confidentiality there if I didn't want that to be made public. So it's pretty unlikely that you are not going to have to self-report some sort of breach. And in some cases as well, and if the ICO deems it appropriate, you will have to inform the end users as well. So the people whose data you've lost, you will have to tell them that you've lost it. You'll also have to report on the amount of data you've lost and the type of data, so what was held in there and the type of information, how it happened, and also what measures you've already put in place or you propose to put in place to stop that specific thing happening again. Once you're on their radar, you will also then have to prove that you've taken necessary measures to protect data overall through internal processes. So, for example, your staff understand GDPR and the processes that go on, and that you have any relevant documentation or privacy policies or anything relevant to the type of data you're holding, and obviously specific policies around particularly highly sensitive data, for example. And you will then also have to show that you've implemented security practices that minimize the risks of breaches themselves. So this would be your cyber security practice in terms of things like antivirus and your firewalls, etc., that we'll go on to. And ultimately, there are no guarantees of fines. So if you do have a breach, no one is saying you will definitely get fined. What you always get a chance to do is to say, look, this is what's happened, and this is what we've done about it, and this is what we intend to do in the future to stop it happening again. So what you need to be in a position to do is be confident that if questioned, you could say, we have made an investment here to do X, Y, and Z around our network and how we store data. And we've also done this around our processes, which we believe maintains kind of the security of that data and how it's used. And going back to that whole idea of the spirit of GDPR, if that was your data and somebody else had that information, what you would expect them to do. Now, that then absolutely needs to be in context. So, for example, if you think of a difference in size of business, so somebody that employs 4 or 5 people and holds a small amount of data versus a business that employs 50, 100, 200 people and probably therefore holds more information, the expectation will be different because the context is different. And likewise, around the sensitivity of that data, if one of those businesses just holds email addresses, phone numbers, and names compared to the NHS, for example, who have all information about your medical records and all of that side of things, then there's going to be a difference in context around what is expected to be done there and how far people could go. So you need to be confident in order to say, look, this is what we've done. This is what we believe was the right approach. Yes, we've fallen foul of something and something's gone wrong in our plan. So therefore, we expect to do this about it. And like I say, I think there's, no matter how much kind of effort you put in, there is always going to be a few gaps. I mean, you could not stop a member of staff who is intent in causing damage, for example, sitting down and copying stuff off a screen on your PC if they so wished, for example, in which case you'd have to look at and say, look, this is an exception, but look at all the things we've done to try and prevent that. And potentially this is what we'll do to try and stop that happening in the future. but ultimately that's where you need to be getting to. So in the interest of trying to break this down into nice manageable chunks, as I mentioned, there's 99 articles in the legislation, but largely speaking, we can break these down into two areas: data processing, so how data is managed, and cybersecurity. As I mentioned, our expertise is primarily around cybersecurity, but we will talk first and foremost about data processing. Now, the data process side of things means that this is a business issue and not just an IT issue, first and foremost. So a lot of these things can't be controlled just by software. There has to be some intervention in terms of staffing and training, but also this is going to be quite specific to your business and how you operate. So you'll need to interpret some of this, how it applies to how you currently manage your data, for example. So the key things really to bring out here are on screen, and I'll start at the top with the right for erasure, which you might have also seen as the right to be forgotten. So what this basically means is I can phone up a company and say, I don't believe you need my information anymore, therefore I'd like you to remove me from your system completely and remove all of my records. So this could be, in a basic scenario, I move all of my broadband, TV, phone and all of that from, say, BT to Sky. I could phone up BT and think, well, I don't really want them keeping my data. There's no real reason for it. So I could go and exercise my right for erasure and ask them to remove me from their database so that I'm no longer on there. Obviously, the risk of them losing that then goes away. Just to be clear as well, if there are other legislations in place that override this, then GDPR does not expect to kind of override them. So there are obviously financial regulations where you have to keep information for a certain amount of time, medical records, criminal records, etc. So i.e. you couldn't be a mastermind criminal, phone up the police and say, I want to exercise my right for erasure around my my past criminal records, for example, because there's other legislations that talk about how that is kept and how long that needs to be kept. Then we have the right for portability. So the idea of this, I believe, originally came from, I think it was the insurance industry that actually kind of pushed this, in that there were complaints around how difficult it was to move from one company to another and sharing all that information about your history and what had happened. And the idea here is actually you are the owner of that data. It's information about you. So if you want to move it from one company to another, that should be made as easy as possible. And both parties need to completely comply with that under GDPR. Next, explicit consent. So there's a slight conflict between this and my last point, which I'll come on to. But ultimately, certainly from where we are right now, we need to move towards an explicit consent process that is in no way kind of underhand. And what I mean by that is, you'll probably know when you go through purchases online, trying not to get emails from that company might mean that you have to tick a box, sometimes untick a box, sometimes untick a couple of boxes or 3 boxes, and they're all worded slightly different, or it's hidden away in the terms and conditions that by doing this, you'll start getting emails and you'll start getting phone calls, whatever it is. Well, now it needs to be very explicit and clear. So it has to be an action, i.e. you have to tick a box, and there also has to be then a confirmation process. So i.e. you get an email that says, we believe you want to sign up for this information, can you confirm? And then you confirm. So that's moving away to try and take away some of that confusion around how consent is currently gathered and moving it to an explicit consent process. And you take that same logic if you're doing other types of marketing. So for example, telemarketing, you need to ask explicit consent to continue to contact people. Likewise, then we get on to removal of consent. What we can't have is a very easy way to sign up, but a very difficult way to unsign up. So it can't be a tick box to sign up and then a 3-page questionnaire or a written letter or 3 phone calls or whatever it is to take to get off of that. It basically says it needs to be as easy to remove yourself as it is to subscribe in the first place. So making sure that process of getting yourself off lists that you don't want to be on, is nice and simple. And that's obviously different from the right for erasure, in that you're happy for someone to hold your data to carry on dealing with you, but you don't want to receive certain types of information from them. And the final one, different rules for B2B and B2C. I've mentioned about grey areas, and you can probably already tell from some of these things I've talking about that these are going to apply different ways, different industries and different types of businesses. But at the moment, we have a real grey area around the different rules for B2B, so business to business, versus B2C, business to consumer. And the reason for that is that there's an existing legislation called the e-privacy directive that currently allows in the B2B world something called implied consent to be used. So what that means is that if I'm in a sales cycle with any of you guys, then I can start to contact you through any methods I choose. Now I have to give you the opportunity to opt out of that process, but the fact that I'm in that kind of sales negotiation stage means I can do that. Now, implied consent really is quite an open-ended statement because people can use that in terms of saying, well, it's implied because I met them once at a networking meeting 4 years ago and I've decided to stay in touch. It's implied consent because we have a shared client somewhere and we think we can work together. And actually, when you look at email, actually under current email rules, you're able to send out an email and as long as you give the opportunity to unsubscribe, you can then carry on emailing someone. So the reason that's how things are at the moment, but the e-privacy directive is currently under review. It was expected to be reviewed and released at the same time as GDPR, but I understand there has been a delay and I haven't yet seen a date of when we expect to see that come out. What I do know is that under that new rule, it looks like there will be an element of implied consent, but it will be tightened up in some way. So I think it will be, we'll see, but I think it will be along the lines of an active engagement. So i.e., it will have to be an active sales process ongoing, and there'll have to be records of that taking place. So if you're using something like a CRM system, a customer relationship management system, having records to say, right, we first engaged with this customer here, with this company here, and therefore we have now contacted them here, 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 and here. We'll see what that happens, but what that means is there's a big grey area over that as GDPR comes in, because technically we're under the current legislation, the e-privacy directive, which if you're thinking, what do I do with my current kind of set of data? Well, at the moment, nothing changes from a B2B point of view, but from a B2C point of view, anything going forward will need this explicit consent receiving through things like email forms, for example. Okay, and the other one, which I'll just touch on, data protection officers. You may have seen these in the news, part of the media coverage. DPOs are basically needed by what's on screen. It's effectively an official position that's required by GDPR. If you think this might cover you, then there's a link at the end of this presentation, and we'll of course send out the slides where there's more information on this. But in short, you probably won't need one, but I do think it's a good idea for every business to have someone who's kind of in charge of GDPR, basically banging the drum about it and making sure that everyone's kind of following suit. So we won't go any further into DPOs, but ultimately the bad news is that that person banging the drum within your business is probably you. It's probably you because you're on this webinar and you're learning about it, but it also probably should be someone that has a good understanding of the business overall, probably a decent understanding of either the sales and marketing or the customer service process within your business, ideally both, and also has at least kind of a decent understanding of IT in there as well. Okay. So let's move on to cybersecurity. So like I say, this is where our expertise really is. And as you can see, the data processing side is probably going to need some of your input in terms of your time, your thought process, and implementing that within your business. Now, with cybersecurity, a lot of the work is being done here is by software and by appliances within your network. So I can't say that this is all going to be free, and there's potentially going to be some investment you need. So apologies if some of this sounds like a bit of a sales pitch, if you like, but what we have to do certainly as an IT company is inform people going, this is where you need to invest and where you need to tighten up security to prevent breaches as best as you possibly can within your budgets and within the size of your business, and obviously related to the sensitivity of data that you've got. And just to give you this in terms of timescales and what this looks like. This is a graph that shows the total amount of malware, so that's malicious software, as I mentioned early on, that there's been since 1984 all the way over on the left as you look at the screen through to 2017 on the right. And the amount of it, different strains, different types of it that exist. And you can see that from about 2007, 2008, this has just gone up and up and up and up. And the main reason for that is around monetization. So the fact that most malware is now monetized, people are making money out of it. And ransomware, as I described earlier, where someone encrypts data on a server or on a PC and then asks for a ransom to get that back, is a perfect example of how that can happen. And if you think that our current legislation is in place from 1998 and how things have changed, you can see why actually stopping breach is one of the major areas that the GDPR is designed to tackle. So in terms of what we know is happening is that there are more attacks. As you see, there's more malware, which means more of it's happening. There's a heightened complexity. Now, of course, this is driven by two things, I think, really. One, monetization, i.e., like I say, the idea that people want to make money out of it, but also the fact that cybersecurity is getting better. We're putting in more and more fences, more and more walls, more and more things to get past for people. So therefore, they need to be cleverer about how they get around them, through them, under them, and past them in order to carry out what they want to do. And more monetization. So this has gone far beyond being a bedroom industry of people making kind of annoying little viruses and bugs that frustrate people into things that actually try to make money. And actually what we see now is the vast majority of malware is either monetized directly or it's being trialed. So it's being tested and kind of given a go to see if it works in order to then be monetized at a later date. So kind of that's what's going on there. And what we see is that it does make money. So there's a few statistics around this, but the one I use is the average wage in Russia is around about $500 a month. Cyber criminals are making about $7,500 a month. So pretty significant and kind of worth their while doing, really. It's also being made pretty easy. We've been talking about cybersecurity for probably about 4 years in terms of doing seminars and things like that. And I remember the first seminar I had on it about 4 years ago, I think had 4 people on it. The webinars we've been running, you've probably seen we've done 4. We've got 2 more tomorrow. So this will be 5 this month. We did 5 at the end of last year at the end of November, and 5 the month before that, because of the amount of demand we're seeing of people now taking it seriously. So we have all been making it very easy for people because we haven't been taking it seriously enough along the way. And it's also very hard to trace. Now, first and foremost, that's because the people that are doing this hacking, creating this malware, know that part of their job is to not get found out. And they're very clever people. They know what they're doing. So they build that into their software. But also, even if you could trace the person, because of kind of cross-border prosecution rules, if you could find out the exact person who hacked your business and they were in Russia or South Africa or South America or wherever it is, the ability to actually be able to prosecute that person is virtually non-existent, which means that it isn't stopping it. It isn't actually getting any better. And although we see from time to time the UK government and various other governments around the world pledge money to try and crack down on cybercrime, it really is very hard for them to do. It's a much bigger political problem than just chucking some money at it. And at the moment, there's no obvious way where we can see that slowing down. Now, this might seem like a bit of a strange slide to have in the middle of a GDPR webinar entitled Forget GDPR, but I strongly believe this. So GDPR has been on the agenda, as I mentioned, since May 2016, but our advice hasn't massively changed since GDPR's come out. It's made a lot of people stand up and listen, but ultimately, this is about not losing your data, not getting hacked. And if we go down the idea of something like ransomware again, so let's assume that your business is hacked and your data is encrypted for ransom, then the first thing that will be in consideration will be your reputation. Because of course you might not be able to operate as a business first and foremost, which means you might have to inform suppliers, you might have to inform customers, you might have to inform your staff and various other people that you've lost their data and you no longer have that information. So your reputation could be affected. If we think about those new rules under GDPR as well, tying in with that, the fact that you might have to self-report could be absolutely key and impact that reputation even further. Next, of course, impacting that loss of data or the loss or the downtime while you try and recover that information. And quite often this is days rather than hours where people aren't able to access their data or aren't able to access their system. So again, if you can't process orders or you can't do whatever you normally do as a business on a day-to-day basis, but you've still got to pay all of your staff, there's a huge issue there straight away. Next, ransom fees. So as I mentioned with ransomware, there's a fee that's slapped on your data and say, right, we've encrypted all of that. We want X amount for you to get that back. And that's normally set at what I would consider to be a sensible level depending on who they've hacked. So if they hack a small or medium-sized business, it's not going to be 10 million, 15 million pounds, for example. It's going to be 10 grand, 15 grand, 5 grand, something that they think they can actually get paid and make some money out of. Now, the worst that we've seen, and we do like to generally talk about what we've seen in real life, was from a business who came to us after they've been hacked. And as you can imagine, as an IT company, we do have businesses that, regardless of us talking about this a lot, haven't taken all of our advice and do get hacked. But we also have businesses who have never dealt with us before and come to us after something like that has happened and say to us, can you help? Now, in that scenario, this business not only got their network and their servers encrypted, but they also got their backup devices encrypted as well. And there was a £25,000 put on each of those, so a £50,000 ransom fee in total. That's the worst that we've seen as a business. I'm sure there's worse out there, but firsthand, that's the worst that we've seen. And next, we've got commercial factors. Now, this is fourth on the list at the moment. And what I mean by this is, so we've had two businesses, so one existing customer and one customer who is in the process of signing up with us from an IT support point of view, say to us, well, how secure are you as a business? How seriously do you take it? Do you practice what you preach? Now, we've got something called a Cyber Essentials certification. This is a government certification that we can help businesses work towards, but we've got ourselves as well that effectively enables us to go, yes, there you go. There's our certification to say that we look after this seriously, which enabled us to win that business and continue working with the other company. And we've also had two of our customers come to us and say, because of their process, their sales process and their supply chain process, that they needed to work to the Cyber Essentials accreditation because of commercial factors too. We've also had a number of businesses do that because they think that's coming in the future and they want to get ready for it. Now, in my personal opinion, I can see that going up that list and potentially even being the #1 factor. I can see it starting to come onto tender documents if you deal with those, but also on people insisting on it when it comes to their supply chain. Because if you make this investment yourself and all this time, effort and money goes into making your business secure, but then you have other people accessing your data and have information going to them and they don't look after it, that's a massive hole in your overall strategy. The perfect example of that on a big scale kind of solution was one of the times that Sony got hacked. I say one of the times because they've been hacked a lot of times, originated from a testing company. So one of the companies that tested their games for them, who had access to their servers, actually the hackers went in through the testing company, used that access to get into the Sony network and went from there basically. So commercial factors is very likely to be a bigger thing in the future. And then GDPR fines. So although everyone can be worried about these fines and these headlines, actually, if you get hacked and you kind of get yourself in this situation, you've probably got a lot of bigger fish to fry before the ICO come knocking on your door and say, right, what's been going on, basically, what's been going on here. So that's the reason why I think, yes, GDPR is important and it makes us all stand up and take notice of it. But actually, this is a business issue. It's not just about GDPR. It's about the other impacts that it has. And I mentioned right at the beginning that scaremongering is not normally my sort of thing and I don't really like it, but I do like to share this. This is my personal conspiracy theory about GDPR. So if you don't mind me indulging in my own personal theory for a minute. So basically at the moment, if we take that ransomware concept, At the moment, when a business does suffer from ransomware and things get encrypted, they have a few options. The normal option is to look at backup and say, right, what's our backup procedure? Have we got information that's available from the day before, for example? Can we afford to lose a day's worth of data, to rekey things, etc., and go down that route? Have we got it? Is there something else we can do to work around this breach and use different information? Has it only affected a small amount of data, for example? Could we even go down sort of a forensics route and see if someone can actually get past that without paying the ransom? Or do we pay the ransom? And you've got plenty of time to make those decisions, ultimately, as long as you want to, depending on the impact on your business. Now, as I mentioned earlier, under GDPR, you have to self-report, and you have 72 hours to self-report once you become aware of a breach. If you don't do that, your fines can actually be doubled. And of course, you might have to inform end users as well. Now, if I was the cyber criminal at the end of this, all of a sudden I've been given a very nice deadline to work towards. So once encrypting your data, what I could now do is say, right, you've got 72 hours to pay me my ransom, or I'm reporting you to the ICO and I'm informing your end users, which from a reputation point of view is obviously not going to be good, and also from a fines point of view could have a massive impact as well. So there's an element of this that is handing a little bit of power over to cyber criminals as well, in my opinion. I'm not saying it's going to happen, and I apologize for my scaremongery approach on this slide, but it's my little conspiracy theory that I'm hanging on to, and I still would not be surprised if we don't see this sort of approach being used in the time after GDPR coming into place. Okay, now what I like to do, I've talked a lot about the theory and how this happens. For the next sort of 10 minutes or so, I just want to give you some practical stuff of how this happens. I don't know how many people on here are techie and understand how this all works, but I'd like to just try and break this down and say, look, in the real world, this is how this all happens. So you can see what's going on a network, how a hacker is thinking, and kind of how that risk manifests itself in real life. So if we take a standard sort of attack, a lot of attacks still come through spam email. So when email comes into an end user and it is delivered to that end user, potentially because there's no spam defense, or it's not set up correctly, or because the email is very good and gets past that spam defense, which is still possible. It hits that PC and it's opened by the end user, possibly because they don't know what they're looking for. So they open the attachment, they open the Word document, they enable the macros on it, and they kind of set off some sort of virus. And that virus then uses the permissions that PC has, so possibly to the server, and then starts encrypting data on that server for ransom. And that potentially could be affected by the fact that the server itself has got outdated security, hasn't been patched, or hasn't got the necessary antivirus on there. So we can see very quickly with just a few little errors in a network how something could kind of work its way from just an email to basically ransoming the data that's on your servers. Another one that we've seen in the last sort of year or so has been things like router IP addresses. So these are sort of things that are used for remote workers or any kind of web services, completely legitimate reason to have them, but maybe not set up properly and having open router ports available that can be visible to people who know what they're doing and know what they're looking for, which means that they can then get onto that router and effectively then from there try and brute force passwords that are on the network. And if you're not familiar with the term brute forcing, also known as dictionary attacks, it basically means trying lots of variations of usernames and passwords over and over again until you get into somewhere. And normally there's kind of a lot of logic used behind that. So they don't, for example, start off with AAAAA and 11111. They'll say, right, well, most admin passwords will have the word admin in it or a variation of admin, and they'll go from there. And of course, passwords, they'll start with password 1 and all the sort of typical things and make some assumptions and try and break their way through there. And if that's successful, then obviously they can get into full permission into that server, certainly if they were to brute force, for example, an admin password, and then again, encrypt data for ransom. And what we can see here is outdated equipment on here, poor passwords, poor configuration. So the setup of something not being right and being exploited by a hacker. So what we really need to think about from an overall point of view when it comes to GDPR and cybersecurity on an IT network is thinking about outdated equipment. So this both takes into consideration things that are old and no longer supported, but also the idea of patching. So when you get those little notifications come up that say there's an update for your Windows device or for your iPhone or whatever it is, normally there's some sort of security update in those processes because a vulnerability has been found and a patch has been released to fix that. So making sure that's happening across your network, because that will take place on servers, on routers, on PCs, and everything else. The network configuration. Sorry, I'm a little bit trigger happy there with me left hand. So network configuration. So making sure this is all set up correctly. So an example would be for your remote workers, making sure that connection into your network is nice and secure. User access, so what can people get to? So for example, if someone were hacked within your business, do they have access to absolutely everything, or is there some limitations there that means actually they couldn't get to certain parts of that server anyway because they don't need to get there? Having a data backup and also having a data backup process. So I mentioned earlier the business that came to us that ended up getting their server and their data backup process, their data backup encrypted. And one of the main reasons is because they did not have a data backup process. So they had a system, and some of you might be aware, basically like a tape backup solution. So someone in your business might be in charge of those tapes. And at the end of each day, they take a tape out, they put a new one in, normally marked up by days of the week. And quite often at the end of the month, the last one comes out of rotation, a new one goes in, and that's kept outside the business kind of as a granddad backup. Now, this business in question hadn't changed that tape for 9 months, so it wasn't auto-ejecting, it was just sitting in there and overwriting every single night. So technically it was working, it wasn't chucking up any errors, but there was no process in place, which meant that when it was encrypted, the last backup they had was 9 months ago. So completely useless, or virtually completely useless. So it's really important to have a process in place, as well as obviously the systems themselves. Remote monitoring, so actually having so many places actively monitoring this and looking for any potential threats along the way as well, we believe is really important. This is the sort of thing that would go to your IT company or to your IT manager, so they can identify things at a really kind of early stage, such as new patches being released or things having early stage problems that can be identified. Then we have to think about external threats. So as well as the overall considerations, what are the things that are coming into our network that could cause problems? So I've mentioned email and spam, putting some control around what can come in there. About web control, so about what websites people can go on. And although a lot of people think this is about stopping staff going on Facebook or Twitter or shopping or whatever in there at their 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, actually this is much more about can I identify a website that's potentially infected and stop people going on that in the first place. Hacking, as we've mentioned a lot about, and malware. And then we have internal threats as well. And I include all of us lot in this as well. So the first one being staff passwords. And I do a lot on staff passwords in some sessions, or should I say passwords in general. And we play a few games and I start trying to guess people's passwords, and within about 5 minutes of meeting me, people are basically telling me their passwords. And we are so free and loose with these passwords, it's untrue. We also have systems that we think are secure but aren't secure. So like having capital letters at the beginning, numbers at the end, and a single word in the middle, for example, quite often a name. So although I won't go into this massively, if I can tell you one thing to do for yourself and also to pass on to your staff and even your friends and your family, is move away from single words and move to sentences, but continue to use your uppercase characters in there and lowercase, so a mix of those, some numbers, and ideally some special characters as well. So come up with a sentence and not a word. Just as easy to remember, but instantly makes it longer and instantly makes it more complex. Because for all the security we can put in the world, if people have terrible passwords, a lot of this can be bypassed. Same when it comes to email and web use, and making sure staff can know what they're looking for, and know what to spot. Managing removable media, so people don't just go willy-nilly plugging in things like removable devices that could have actually been on computers at home that aren't protected and then brought into your network. And then constant training as well. So this isn't a one-stop thing. This is about regularly keeping staff up to date, either because they become complacent or because you have new people join your business. So a good network, it's got staff trained, it's got advanced antivirus. And when I say advanced antivirus, this is antivirus that looks for behavior rather than what we call signatures. So signatures is effectively having a big long list of known viruses, whereas advanced antivirus is looking at behavior. So sticking with the ransomware idea, that means that ransomware rapidly encrypts files. Advanced antivirus is saying, no, I don't expect anything to do that. Stop it in its tracks as soon as possible. Modern equipment across our networks, making sure our servers and our devices that kind of manage the whole network are up to date and patched. Having policies in place to manage things like the right for erasure, like the right for portability. Having some sort of spam protection to stop those external threats coming into the network. Having some sort of web control to monitor which websites people can go on. Having modern equipment for staff as well. So the obvious example at the moment is Windows XP machines, not having them on your network because they are not supported by Microsoft anymore, which means they don't release security patches for them, which means if someone finds an exploit for them, then there's nothing in there that's going to stop it. And it's also worth considering as well that Windows 7, we're only 2 years away now from the end of life of that product, and that will be in exactly the same situation as Windows XP in January 2020, which sounds like a long time away. It sounds like the future, doesn't it? But actually, January 2020 is just less than 2 years away now of when the actual date is. User access being managed. So my worst example of that is I've got 2 friends who left a business and after 18 months could still get into their web email, hadn't been removed from the system at all. Simple things like that. Having the data backed up and having a process and policy, and having a remote monitoring process going on as well to make sure, like I said, we can early identify things as they come on. And what we're talking about here, apologise for the slightly gruesome slide, but basically we're talking about a layered approach to security here. So this is about the whole idea that every single thing you do puts an extra layer of protection as you go, and the holes in your network get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's the idea, to make it as difficult as you possibly can. And going right back to that early stage where I said is you need to be able to stand up and say, what have we done? It's like, right, well, these are our approaches to the right for erasure. These are our approaches to the right to portability. This is how we currently get consent. This is how we protect our network. This is how we manage remote users, etc., etc., etc. They will be looking for this layered approach that you've thought of every single different area to limit those risks that could happen across your business. So let me just give you an example. Like I said, I've given you some basics of that. I'm going to give you a real life working example. So this is speeded up slightly. It's a video that shows antivirus actually working in place. So the user we've got here is someone that's logged into a corporate network, so with their credentials, and they have actually encryption on this network. So it shows that these files are encrypted. So they can only actually get to those files because they are logged into that network. Also got antivirus, advanced antivirus on the system, which is working fine. What this means is that they've got sort of the full permissions you'd expect any user to have. So we've seen they can open their documents, and they can also go online and browse the web, and everything's working fine. And if we look in the back end of Sophos, which is the package that's running here, we've got 2 heartbeats. What that means is that the network is running well and the device that we're on is running well. So the 2 things are talking to each other successfully. That's why we've got 2. So we're now going to go on to some email, and we're going to open something dodgy, which is this Word document. We've got macros there that we're going to enable. So that's to enable Word to run a little program in the background, basically, which, as we can see now, fires up a warning from our antivirus because it's a threat. And we can see we've got a threat detected, which turns us red. Our system's at risk, which means our heartbeat has gone. So the network is good, which is green, but our PC, our workstation here, is currently now at risk. So what happens is the network then immediately quarantines our system. So it puts us out of action. It's not contactable, so it can't access the website. It can't access the files as well. So the internet, it can't speak in and out, and it can't speak to the rest of the network, meaning that if someone's on that PC, actually, they can't be doing a whole lot here. So we're now going to clear that up. So that's been sort of live on the system for 10 seconds, 15 seconds or so. And now we've cleared that up, we can see that we have 2 in the top right, 2 heartbeats. So both the PC and the network are all working working fine, which means that we now have all of our permissions given back to us. We can go on the internet again, for example, and we can access our files. And what's also important, certainly from an IT admin point of view here, and it's a little bit technical, it's nice to see what happens in the background and what this gives your IT administrators, is they can go and look into this from a root cause analysis perspective and say, well, how did this happen? And this visualization it seems to be what IT guys absolutely love, in that they can drill in and say, right, where did this start? What are all the things it tried to touch? And if you remember, this was going for sort of 10 seconds or so, and this shows all the different things that it tried to get hold of and tried to affect. And the red icon here is the beacon events, where it started, which was from our Word document. And then we can see it tried to read and write various different files along the way before it was stopped in its tracks. But that's how rapidly it happened, and even reaching out there to different IP addresses. But actually, all that software in the back doing its work for us. The other thing we really like, just coming towards the end now, is something called Fish Threat. And this is about constantly training staff. So what this enables us to do is to send out by email staff training sessions, but also then test staff. So what we can do is, after we send out training sessions, is then send out fake looking emails, which at the back of them have some training sessions. So if they do click on one of those links, rather than getting a dodgy email, a dodgy virus, they actually get a training session that they need to complete. And then in the back end of that, we can then report and say, right, who's been completing the training, or who's been clicking on these emails, and we can address that how we want to address that, either with further training, by talking to those staff, or potentially by adding extra controls over what sort of information they receive into their inbox. And what we found within our organisation is this actually gets staff to look out for each other. So these go back to, I think, April, which shows how long we've been using it. And the one on the left is a member of staff who actually emailed to everyone else and said, look out, guys, there's a dodgy email going around. And the one on the right is someone posting up on a product called Yammer, which is part of the Office 365 suite, a bit like Facebook for businesses, if you like, so an internal Facebook, and saying, look out, guys, this is what this email looks like. Don't click on it. It's a dodgy one. Okay, so in terms of what I believe you need to do next, I think first and foremost, you need to review your data processing. So how that flow of data happens within your business, and who needs to be aware of the process, such as the right for erasure and the right for portability. You also then need to look at your IT security and say, where are the risks within our business of potentially losing data, and what have we done so far, and where do we need to tighten up? If you need to, you can speak to us. We are more than happy to help. Or if you've already got, obviously, an IT company or an IT expert in-house, speak to them and come up with a plan about how to protect yourselves against this. We have now, I think, 4 months to the day, so we are running out of time. As an IT business, just to give you an example, and I'm sure this is very similar across the country, we are expecting a mad rush come sort of March onwards when it comes to installing systems to get everyone compliant for it. So it is something you need to be thinking about as soon as possible if you believe there's work to be done. And if you want to read more, I've given you a link here, and like I say, we'll send around these slides. I'm pointing you to the ICO website, which is, if you like, straight from the horse's mouth. These are the guys that are going to enforce this, and their website's great. It's broken down in a really nice way, very understandable. This is where the information about data protection officers is as well. There's an easy link on the left-hand side. So apologies, I've gone slightly over my time from what I originally suggested. So thank you very much for sticking around. I'm more than happy to answer any questions if people have them and they want to stick around. If you need to go, because I know I've taken up your hour, then thank you very much for listening to me. My email address is on screen there. Please do feel to ask me any questions on email. All I would ask at the moment is, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have a broken arm, so emailing left-handed is pretty tricky. So if you have a question, and you could drop your your phone number on there as well, I'll give you a call and we'll have a chat about it. And that will be best for me if that's okay. But if anyone does have any questions and they want to drop them in the little question section at the moment, then I will do my best to answer them now. In fact, I think there's some coming in at the moment. Right, first question. Does GDPR include paper copies, i.e. hard copy personal files? Two answers, really. First one being yes, in that in terms of protecting it and looking after it and making sure it's not lost, then absolutely. So if that's the way that you store your information, then you are expected to look after that and control it. And although I've talked a lot about IT security, I guess you could equally talk about how well that's secured in terms of your business. The no part of it would come down in some cases to the right for erasure. So, for example, if I were to phone up your business and say I want to exercise my right for erasure, but my name was in hard copies of things, so potentially paper copies, certainly things like video, audio, and actually even data backup, where it would be very difficult to remove me individually, then that is noted specifically in GDPR as being an exception to those rules. So depending on what that paper copy was, i.e., for example, if it was just one document again about me and it was all filed away and there was no other legal reason to keep it, you'd have to remove it. But if I was listed, for example, in documentation where there were lots of other information about lots of other people and it was deemed kind of unreasonable, then that part would be excluded from GDPR. But in terms of the basics of looking after it, the answer is absolutely yes. Next question. Does GDPR mean that it will be impossible to obtain prospect lists or to end up on one yourself? I can give you two answers to this one. I can give you the official GDPR one, or I can give you the common sense. Let's be realistic about what's going to happen here. So the official one is, unless you opt in, technically you can't find yourself on a prospect list, by which I assume you mean, for example, when people buy lists of data and you end up there. Technically, no. Realistically, it will carry on happening. I'm sure it will carry on happening. I've already asked some of the companies where we've purchased data from in the past and things like that to say, well, how are you getting around that? And they have some pretty creative answers. Some of them talking about the fact that if information is already publicly available, so for example on Companies House and things like that, then that doesn't mean that they're finding that information, and it's down to the end user then to find permission. But GDPR official line, you're absolutely right. It will be impossible to end up on a prospect list. It's a bit like putting yourself on the telephone preference service, though, isn't it? In that you can put yourself on it, but you still get phone calls. Is it now illegal to sell prospect lists? I think the question's similar. I can't see how the practice will carry on going. I can't see how they will get around it without specifically going and asking permission from people to be on lists to do that. So they will know more about that. That's their business. How they get around that, I don't know. I'm sure they have strategies and they're talking about it right now. I don't know tons about it is my quick answer. But technically, around GDPR, the answer would be it's going to be very tricky to get around. Okay, is any other questions that are going to tick through at the moment? Would it be best off just deleting old mailing lists? It's an interesting question, not specifically listed in GDPR. So if I could just reword that question, because the way that I get asked it normally is, what do I do with my current database? So for example, so somebody on a webinar yesterday said, I've got 8,000 people on my mailing list. I've been sending them my catalogue for 30 years plus. Do I now need to go and get explicit consent from every single one of them to do that? Now, GDPR is not, it's a regulation, so it doesn't tell you how to do things and guidance. Now, my interpretation, and like I said, this is why we have a legal disclaimer, I guess, at the front, but my interpretation of this is that if you've been following best practice, which is effectively sending things out and giving people the chance to opt out, under current legislation, that constitutes consent. So therefore, when it comes to May, you have got consent from those businesses under the legislation that's been going on, and therefore it will carry over. We will have to keep our eye on that to see exactly how that's interpreted by the ICO post the 25th of May. But that's my personal opinion. If they come down heavy-handed on that, then there are going to have to be monumental changes to the way that people carry out marketing at the moment. And I think we would have been given a lot more notice if that was the case. That's my personal opinion on it. If you don't have proof that I've signed off, so yeah, so sorry, you added a little bit on that. So yeah, basically at the moment you don't technically have to have proof. You don't have to have proof that you've done that. Some people, some email providers, for example, do insist on that, but legislatively you don't. The only exception being that is if you're dealing in the US. There's some rules around dealing with US clients where you do have to have explicit consent already, which I don't do, so I don't know loads about, and then maybe other ones. Oh, good. Thanks. Yeah, that covers it. Great. I think that looks like that's all the questions. Like I say, my email address is on screen. Please feel free if anything else comes up to ask me about it. I hope you understand where there is some grey area. I'm still reading about this on a daily basis myself. I don't pretend that it's easy. I don't pretend that there aren't grey areas along the way. So any questions you've got, I really appreciate, because it gives me something else to try and understand. And of course, just like you guys, I'm involved in running a business, and we have all of these challenges as well. But hopefully you can see we can take like I say, a common sense approach to it. And hopefully this won't be the end of the world for us all, and we'll all be able to carry on doing well as businesses like we are now. So thank you very much for your time. As I've mentioned, we will be sending around the slides. But like I said, any more questions, let me know. But thank you very much.